or even here, 6 o'clock in the evening. But anyhow, anywhere in the world, now it's time for the ACTO forum call. And I bid you welcome, and I'm delighted that everyone has enrolled in such large numbers. So what Harry didn't say, but maybe it's good to know that we, as usual, will make a recording of this forum call. This forum call is available soon after today, and it's free, of course, to listen again to this forum call. You can find it on the ACTO website under the heading of resources, and it's the same place where you've also registered. So that's another practical thing. And now I think we can have more attention for Margaret. Margaret, I feel very honored that I may introduce you. And in my eyes, Margaret has done so many things for the coaching profession that I think it's difficult to decide where to start. And that's why I will give you some personal notes. Margaret once told me that she worked almost in a previous life in a private law practice. And it's hard to imagine for me because I know you as a coach. And for me, you're more like a mother of coaching. Because since, I think, 1919 and maybe 92, you have been involved in all developments of the coaching profession. You are so passionate in believing that professional coaches can change the world. Wow, that's a big vision. In order to do that, we must bear ourselves as professionals. Professional coaches seek great coach training, hold high coaching standards and ethics, clearly understand the boundaries of coaching. And professional coaches are committed, as you say, to being the best for their clients and finding the best in their clients. And with all this experience you have got during many, many years, and I'm so happy you will share it today with us in relation to the PCC markers. So I wish all of us the inspiration and fun with this forum call, and therefore I like to give the floor to Margaret.
Thank you, Anita. So that's a very kind introduction, and far more than I deserve, I have to say. I became a coach in 1993, early 94, and there were many, many people before me, both in Europe and in the Americas, who really birthed coaching. And I was fortunate enough to follow those pioneers. And I think all of you around the world, and I know we have a global audience, are in some way a pioneer yourself, either because of the time you started coaching when coaching was really relatively unknown, or because you step into a transition that takes you from a former life into a new life and a new evolution. So I was in France recently, and I was asked what I was most proud of in the ICF. And my answer was, I'm proud of us, that we are the ICF, and just as we are ACTO, and all of you as coaching educators are pioneers as well. And we created something that's meaningful in the world and that many people seek to imitate and use the terminology of. And we're here today because we've all together as a community and as a group understood the idea of emerging greatness from others. And so when I was asked what I was most proud of, I'm proud of us for creating a profession and for creating standards within that profession and for being committed professionals to both ourselves and, most importantly, to our clients. And I'm delighted to introduce with me today another committed professional who's been my dear friend for a long, long time, and I think a model coach and a model colleague and everything one wants coaching to be in the world. So I have brought along with me today Tracy Stevens, who is a coach educator who I first met at Coach U, who is on my faculty at the University of Miami, but is also on the faculty of other coach training organizations, and on a regular basis shares her passion and wisdom and knowledge and tremendous skill as an instructor with coaching students around the world. So Tracy, if you could say hello.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Margaret. I'm delighted to be here with you to share whatever is appropriate from my perspective. Thanks.
Thanks. And the kind of the cornerstone for my conversation with you all today is what I learned, and I invite Tracy, and I think Christian may be on the call as well, what I learned as a coaching educator by being involved in the marker process, and how it has enhanced my view of coaching education, and what it has adjusted in my view of how how the program at the University of Miami should operate. Tracy has been through the training as an assessor. I think Christian has as well. And if he's on the phone, I invite him to add his 2 cents, as we say in America, or €2 as we go along. I also want to say something very clearly. I am not a representative of the ICF. I am a volunteer who works for the ICF. I don't set policy. I don't have access to the board. I don't do anything for the ICF except work for free on occasion. And I say that in the beginning because I don't want anyone to think that my opinions are actually ICF policy. What I'm going to be talking about today is really my opinion of what changed for me, or it was enhanced for me, and my learning out of being in the markers process as a coach educator. But I don't want that to be confused in any way with any formal pronouncements or any information of any kind from the ICF. It's just my personal experience. So with that caveat, I'd like to go ahead and start, unless there are any questions from the organizers, who I thank very much for making this time possible, or from any of the participants about the context of the conversation. Okay, Hallie gives me the thumbs up, so we're going to launch. So when I first started the markers process, many years ago it seems now, but it's only been about 2.5 to 3, I had been in coach education for a long period of time. And I had been training coaches through a number of organizations and had written coach training material. And I got to say, I thought I was pretty sharp at it. What happened for me during the markers process is, what came home to me is that there are a number of places where I could be much better as a coach educator, and the programs that I was associated with could be much better in coach education. And those areas were 3 in particular. The first was that I recognized that through the conversations we were having, that I had a lot of biases when I listened to coaching. And that those biases impacted both the way I listened to coaching and the credit I gave for coaching. They also impacted how I designed coach training material. And so one of the things that came home to me very early on was that I had to manage my biases around my view of coaching to be sure that I was creating the broadest legitimate form of coach training possible, and that within that coach training, I was giving full credit to students where they were evidencing good coaching, but I was also hearing more fully those places where coaching was not being fully evidenced. And I was not going to let the bias of someone being a student of our program, or a student of mine, or a mentee of mine interfere with my ability to hear the evidence of their coaching objectively. So that's the first place I recognized there was an area of growth for me. The second place was within the program material that I was creating and teaching and that my faculty was teaching at the University of Miami, I realized we could do a much better job of teaching people how to structure coach questions. That what I was noticing was that our students were learning questions, but there was not enough emphasis put on how do you listen, and out of that, how do you actually structure a coach question versus rely on coach questions that we have all learned through our coaching careers, some of which we love, and by the way, some of which I think we hate, which is also a part of my bias, was really learning which questions triggered me in a particular way. My favorite, of course, is if you knew the answer, what would it be? Which is like fingernails on a backboard. I see Hallie doing that same. But it triggers something in the way you listen to the rest of coaching. Part of the reason that students use those questions is because we weren't spending enough time saying, how do you, in your mind, emerge a coaching question out of what the client gives you? Instead of having them rely on questions they heard from us. So I'm writing some new material now that's really about learning how to structure coach questions versus learning how to repeat coach questions. I think the third place where I realized we had some good material, but we could have better material was on the ACTO partnership. What separates coaching from other fields is that it is a technology of emerging from others. And it is according to the definition, a partnered relationship. And what does partnership mean? And it was clear in the markers conversation that we came more and more to the fact that partnership is the affirmative act of giving choice back to the client about the direction of the session. And the affirmative act of asking clients to comment on our observations and to edit us as coaches. So that rather than leading the conversation directly or indirectly by choosing what is going to be talked about, not the topic, but the way it's talked about, instead of that we really were in the act of giving the continual work of choosing the direction of the session, the depth, the amount of time we spent on something, the importance of particular topics when there were multiple topics on the table, giving that decision-making process and that thinking work back to the client was the affirmative act of partnership. And that we needed to be better at giving students tools to incorporate that affirmative act of partnership, not just in the agreement and the closing, but throughout a coaching session and a coaching process. I think the last place that I really felt that the markers work and being in the conversation about what is the evidence of coaching at the PCC level, because that's where the markers sit, is at the beginning PCC level, was really around understanding the holistic nature of the session at a deeper level, rather than responding to single phrases at a time as people coach. And communicating that idea to students, that you're looking at creating a holistic picture of the client versus simply responding, which is what happens at an ACC level, versus simply responding to the last thing a client said. And that we could teach that better in our program as well. And so for me, the markers work where we listen to, I have to say, hundreds of hours of coaching as we were creating them, and really hearing how coaching was evidenced in the competencies, but with slightly different styles and slightly different nuances from program to program and from culture to culture around the world, really brought home to me the breadth of the way coaching can be evidenced, but also how important the competency base, that those evidences are based in the competencies. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to create some room for Tracy or anyone else on the call who had been through the training to comment and to add, subtract, or disagree with what I've said in relationship to their learning as a coach educator out of the markers.
Hi, everybody. It's Tracy. Something I would add, in addition to what Margaret's already shared, is that by using the markers now and sharing them with students, we're finding, at least I'm finding, across platforms, meaning different coach training schools, I'm finding that the students are actually grasping the coaching concepts a bit faster than I had observed historically. And therefore, they're able to apply the skills earlier in their programs in a way that's allowing them to go deeper. So I think that's a huge opportunity for all of us as we are understanding the markers and how they are evidenced, and then teaching to that in a manner that allows them to expand their ability to apply the competencies is just a wonderful addition to all that we have learned and are continuing to learn from these markers. One of the key areas that I have found personally that has helped me tremendously in my coaching is that although I've always been a pretty good listener, but more from the clients who have said, wow, how did you hear that? My hearing and my ability to notice what's happening has increased substantially by going through this training and by then applying it in the classrooms. So even the trainers and those of us who are writing curriculum and then teaching it are also benefiting dramatically in our ability to then convey the ways to evidence the markers as well as to expand the capabilities of our students. So those are just a few additional pieces for now from my perspective.
And before we open for questions, I'd also say that an important thing to keep in mind about the markers is the markers are simply the ways to evidence the competencies. They do not change the competencies. The competencies are the same thing that we've always done. And also as coaching educators, they don't require us to give up the nuances of our own programs that are added in our execution of the competencies. So for example, at the University of Miami, we've always put a fair amount of emphasis on partnership. We continue to do that. And each of your programs have their own essential greatness to them that is your way of evidencing the competencies. And I really encourage you as educators to keep that and also to consider how you might broaden that so that your students have a very broad base of methodology to evidence the competencies and the markers versus a narrow base. I think that's for me, again, the great gift of the markers and of listening to all these tapes is to really to see the breadth and depth of how coaching can be evidenced and to bring that gift back to my students at Miami. So Hallie, I'm ready to take some questions. Tracy and I are ready to take some questions or some other comments from anyone else who's been in the training.
Okay, there's a question in the chat that I'll pass on, and absolutely we're open to others. Janice is saying, are you saying that the evidence for the markers is in the competencies? Will you address the evidence base for the competencies?
No, what I was saying is that the markers are the evidence of the competencies. So that when you are listening to coaching, the markers give a relatively clear and easy way to hear the competencies and a very factual way to evaluate whether or not the competencies are in fact being evidenced. Do we have any other questions?
This is Nadine, and I do have general question about the markers for competencies 9, 10, and 11, which are all bunched together, and it's the same way in the table that compares ACC, PCC, and MCC level for assessment. So why is it sort of bunched in one way? What does it mean, the fact that it's all in one category as opposed to separate like the other competencies?
Yeah, when we were we did a lot of research in creating the markers, and when we were listening to tapes and looking at prior markings on evaluations of tapes, what we saw was that there was always overlap in the markings, and that the commentary on why assessors marked scored 9, 10, and 11, competencies 9, 10, and 11 were often precisely similar to each other. So we played both in the creation process, we played both in keeping them separate and doing some evaluating and marketing with their separate, and then bringing them together. And what we saw was that there was a lot of overlap in the evidence that would evidence 9, 10, and 11. So we found that it worked more simply to group them together, because often the evidence would evidence all three of them versus a single competency. So that's part of the reason that they're grouped together. And in the testing mechanism, the feedback we've had from assessors who have been trained and who have been evaluating tapes is that it works much more easily than the old system. It is not to denominate that they are and you'll notice that 9, 10, and 11 each are held in that single grouping. You'll see them play out there in the markers. So it is not in any way to diminish their importance, but to look at the practicality of how they're actually demonstrated.
Thank you very much. I'd like to clarify something else with respect to that. If I understand correctly, this grouping, it is really how the coach manages or puts a frame around the conversation, or keep the conversation going toward the session goal. Yeah, it's more the management of the coaching session as opposed to all the awareness and the powerful questions and the relationship itself.
I wouldn't say that it's the management of the coaching session, because the framework and management of the coaching session is a partnership between the coach and the client. It is to ensure that if the client desires it and if it is appropriate to the session, that the client walks out of the session with a path for the work between the sessions. So, but the management piece is part of the partnership between the coach and the client.
So 3 and 4.
Again, you'll notice that if you read through the markers, that the markers refer to partnership throughout the entire session. And I would not so much separate. I would view the markers holistically as well. There are markers for particular competencies, but within the context of a session, you'll see the markers you'll see those competencies overlap, and they should overlap throughout the session. You're not going to see them at least I hope you don't always see them in a precise order. So as you think about them and you think about educating to them, because that's really the focus here, as you think about educating to them, I would recommend you think about educating how the partnership creates the management of the session and a joint management of the session by the coach and the client, with the coachee, with the client actually leading and denominating the direction of the session most of the time. And even the client has a choice, and you'll see this in the wording of the markers as to whether or not they think designing actions is they're at an appropriate point in whatever the issue is to design actions. So again, that partnership piece kind of underlies the entire session.
Okay. Thank you very much, Margaret.
You're very welcome.
We have another question, two questions in the chat bar, both from Anita. Probably something that other people are interested in as well. So the first question is, can you discuss why competency number 1 is not addressed in the PCC markers directly? And can you tell us something about the actual scoring? So does a student need 100% on the markers, or how does that actually physically work?
Yeah, so I want to say that it was not my intention to go through the markers in that way in this call. I really wanted to focus on the education piece. So I'd like to get the questions back to that if I could. I will in answer to this. Competency number 1 is in fact addressed in the markers because there are 2 disqualifiers, including an ethics disqualifier. So that if we see a significant ethical issue, there's a place to actually disqualify the applicant from receiving the credential. That has to be a very clear ethical breach. There's also a place if the coach steps out of the role of coach for a significant part of the session to disqualify the tape. That again, it has to be clear and convincing, so to speak. It can't be a matter of subjective opinion. It's got to be very clear within the tape. So we don't disqualify tapes. And by the way, that's also reflective of the old system, which had ethics as a disqualifier at the end of the score sheet. And the second part of that question was? The actual scoring. So how does one qualify or not? I'm not going to get into the actual scoring. I don't have the authority to do that. So that question I'm going to pass on.
Okay.
That should go back to the ICF.
Okay. I have a question for how I'm enrolled by you and Tracy. I'm like, I want to dig in. I want to start right now. So I have a question about how you're introducing it to your students and how you're using it, the markers in your curriculum. I'm a Canadian, and I'm remembering some sort of skirmishes in the 70s about standardized testing and how teachers began teaching to the test, and they eventually got thrown out. And I see that there's an opportunity to not do that, but I'm interested in how you're using them.
Yeah, I'm going to let Tracy start, and then I'll come back in with my plan, which I'm just developing to fully introduce them to the students at Miami. But I'm going to let Tracy start because she works in a number of programs and that have already introduced the markers. So Trace?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do work in multiple schools, and each school is addressing it in a manner that is supportive of their curriculum. And one in particular is now incorporating the markers into the practicums. So we have actual practicums in this school that are where the students are coaching and they're receiving direct feedback. Part of their homework assignments between classes is to take one set of competencies. So for example, creating the coaching agreement, look at the markers, which is the evidence of that competency, and notice how they are being applied in the coaching conversation. Not that we're going to use the exact language of a marker, because if that occurs, you're going to hold that coach is going to be demonstrating something other than the competency at PCC level. So there is a customization that's still taking place, yet we are still able to hear that that particular marker is in fact in evidence. So that's being built into the class time and into the homework assignments so that the students are understanding how, and I'll use terminology from some of the schools, how their own voices are able to be heard in their coaching and still demonstrate the competency. And evidence, our language today is now evidencing those competencies and the markers as stated. So we're building that in one school. And it's been extremely effective so far. It's very early in the process, but we are noticing that there is a growth taking place for the students, which ultimately is the intent. You know, we're there to support the students through their learning. One of the other schools that I work with, it's more organic. It's becoming part of the language of the faculty. And so the language is now at a more organic level. It's just simply informing and incorporating that language into the training. So those are two very specific examples of how they're being built in. And Margaret, so let me give it back to you or see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I'll add the beginnings of my plan at Miami because I'm still formulating it. So one piece of it is to actually sit down and have conversations with the faculty about the markers and my learning around the markers. And many, I would say about 4 of our faculty were in the assessor training, their learnings around the markers and sharing that in community. I think the second piece that's important for us is incorporating the markers as a way, as Tracy said, as a way for students to begin to hear coaching. One of the things I've found in the past in all of the schools that I've worked in is that students tend to hear coaching because their ears are young, both as coaches and in terms of evaluating coaching, that often they hear coaching incorrectly when they're listening to other students coach. So they say things that are good that really aren't quite so good. And one of the things that I think the markers do is they give students a way to hear more coaching more accurately and therefore incorporate more accuracy into their own coaching. I think the great danger we all face is that students start coaching to the list of markers and trying to do the check mark on the list. And by the way, this is not a new danger in all of our programs. As we teach theory, students start coaching to the theory rather than really listening and responding to the client and beginning to build their listening to be holistic rather than just responsive to the last thing the client said. So we have some specific things we're going to incorporate in some specific material at Miami about not coaching to the list. And I will say at Miami, we actually started doing our own version of markers some time ago. It's not precisely like the ICF version because we have some things we emphasize that we intend to test that actually we hold a slightly higher standard than the ICF around because they're critical to what we teach in the program, and therefore it's critical that a student who graduates our program understands them at a deep level. And we tell students from the very beginning they get our version of the markers for the entire second half of the program, and all of their feedback is done on that version of the markers. And we have told them, and we will continue to tell them as we introduce the ICF version of the markers, that you cannot coach to the list. If you are not responsive to the client and the markers don't emerge, the evidence does not emerge out of response to the client, what will happen is you will become not present to the client and present to the conversation in your own mind about, did I hit the marker? So I think you have to keep emphasizing that with students so that they don't treat the list itself as coaching, because the markers are only given credit in the ICF And I hope within our programs, as we use them, if they're used in response to the client and appropriately in response to the client rather than as a formulaic response to the client. So I think that's the great challenge as you introduce them as an educator.
Great, thank you.
And I think I see another question from Carlos, maybe?
Yes, Mickey would like to add an opinion, and then Carlos, great comment about presence. Is there anyone working on MCC markers? So let's hear from Mickey McMillan first.
Thanks, Howard. Actually, Margaret, you just addressed something that I was thinking about with regard to looking at the markers, but really seeing them from a system place as well as an individual case. And so, in marking someone, we have to have the focus of being able to see do the coaches actually demonstrate the evidence that are in the individual markers, but in the context of the whole coaching session. So it isn't just the checklist, as you say, and that's such an important part. And for me, as one of those who is going through the training, it's the hardest piece for me to really reconcile is looking at it from a systems view as well as an individual competency view and reconciling that. The other piece I want to emphasize of what you had said, and a kind of a preview of coming attractions, is the biases conversation that we had. I started that conversation in the classroom with all of you thinking, I'm not biased. I've got this all figured out. And then as I studied it and looked really deeply within my soul, I have a lot of biases, and would immediately score lower if I heard a question that would be like fingernails on a chalkboard. And so it was a huge self-awareness process for me that is continuing. Thank you.
And before I get to Carlos's, I want to build off a couple things Mickey said. The first is the bias conversation is something we're going to incorporate for our students. That conversation about what biases do you bring as a coach? How do they reflect in your coaching? What do they trigger in you when you're listening to someone? What does it mean about which competencies you might default to or not default to? So, for example, if you have a real need to be of service, which is at one level a bias, it may truncate the amount of partnership you do. So we always talk about, and it's in the competencies, about coach self-management. The conversation about biases for students at a deep level, I think, can be an incredibly illuminating conversation, particularly if it's a continual conversation through a program. If you start it in the initial time that a student comes into a program, and you continue to have them look at how their own biases play out for them in their coaching, in their listening in particular, and then also in how they use the competencies. I think you can perform an immense service for creating a clear platform for listening in young coaches. And the other thing is, in terms of systemic, is the idea of teaching the competencies as a holistic system rather than as parts. We all start, I think, and at one level we need to teach the parts of the competencies. But there is a place where we have to shift if we're going to help people get into PCC level, where we have to shift to teaching the systemic version of the competencies and how the system plays in response to the client, and how the competencies interweave with one another. And that's been made so clear to me by working on the markers, that by separating them originally and then having to bring it back together to design the training for the markers, it really has honed for me that in the first part of a program, we may need to teach the parts, but there is a definitive shift that has to take place to teaching the systemic pieces. And then in quick answers to Carlos, and then I'm going to ask Tracy if there's anything else she wants to say. There is some MCC work going on. It's in its beginning days, and we will be coming back to the community with that work later on. But it's really kind of in its beginning days right now. So Trace, anything you want to add on this topic?
Yeah, I think just an observation, and as I'm listening to the questions and I'm listening to the responses that are coming, there's three key areas for me as an educator that are standing out. One is the actual evaluation of competencies, and I'm using that collectively, all of the competencies. So there is the evaluation of that, and oh, by the way, just so you have this awareness, a person may demonstrate a marker and get credit in multiple competencies for demonstrating that marker, because it is the whole conversation that we are evaluating. Then there is the piece on teaching. The student to model, demonstrate, evidence those markers that have been determined, not unlike one of you was mentioning, I think it was Mickey, who mentioned, the schools have taught to a test, and that found out that didn't work. That didn't educate the students. So we're not going to be, I don't anticipate, at least in any of the schools I'm involved in, that we're going to be teaching to the markers, and you must demonstrate this marker exactly as stated. But these are foundational to the demonstration of competency. So that's another piece in the teaching. And then the third component that I'm observing here in the conversation today is the learning component. How are the students learning those core competencies that we've been teaching since the very beginning? And how do we as a coach training organization continue to teach such that our students learn? And we're not asking you to change what you do. We're just simply saying we're getting better. We're growing up as a profession, and we now can measure through the evidence the delivery of coaching skills and competencies to a much higher level than we could historically. So one might anticipate that as a profession grows and we get better at what we do, we're also going to get better at measuring what we do. So those things are standing out for me just as an observer to the conversation today. Margaret, that might have stimulated some more thinking on your part or additional comments.
Oh, well, it did stimulate some more thinking on my part. There's a distinction I want to draw. Tracy mentioned that you might get credit for multiple markers. There may be a piece of evidence that or pieces of evidence, because it's very rarely a single piece of evidence. It's multiple pieces of evidence. There may be evidence that supports multiple markers, so that you would get credit out of, for example, a powerful question about emotions is both evidence of the marker related to questioning, but it's also evidence of the listening. Because you reflect the emotion you heard in the question. So you might get, that evidence might count toward more than one marker. We have found that evidence can count toward 2 or 3 markers. It does not, a single piece of evidence or a single group of evidence generally does not count toward more than 2 or 3 markers. So you wouldn't have a single group of evidence and have 20 markers marked. The other thing is I want to be really clear that we understand that when we talk about the markers are really only the evidence of good coaching. So I don't want the conversation about the markers to seem as though it's a conversation that is any different than the conversation about having high standards for teaching coaches how to be good coaches. Because all of them, the way the markers were developed was by listening to hundreds of coachings and saying, in these coachings, what was the evidence of the good coaching and how do we describe it in a way that can be reliably listened for and recognized and evaluated. So I just want to be really clear about that we're really talking about in this education piece and in the markers themselves, all we're really talking about is a new way of describing the evidence of good coaching and how that new way of describing might assist us as educators to hone our way of educating good coaches. So Hallie, do we have any other questions or comments?
We do. I'm not sure if they may be more ICF goal oriented or pertinent to the ICF, but I will put them out there, and if you can answer them and want to, you can. But one question about, is there any possibility that someone will be creating ACC markers at any point in the future?
I think that's really an ICF question. I can say it's the lower priority right now because the pass rate on the ICF exam, even before the changes, where not as many people have to take it because they're graduates of or have been through accredited coach training program or ACSTH programs, the passage rate was about 96%. So when we look at the priorities, when the ICF has looked at the priorities, I can say they denominated as priority PCC, then MCC, and ACC. If they go to markers, will come later.
All right.
But the exact plan, again, I want to be clear. I'm not talking on behalf of the ICF, so the exact answer to that question really should come from the ICF.
Yeah. I kind of suspect the other questions that I got are in the same department, but you might be able to offer some information. Again, please pass if you need to, but I know I'm interested and I would love to do the training, and some other people here are asking how and where can they get the training?
Pass to George Rogers, who I don't know whether he's on the call or not. But I am delighted to say I am not administratively in charge of that. And I am also delighted to say I will never accept administrative responsibility for that.
Okay. Okay.
And I would encourage people, I know, for example, this morning that was discussed on the ICF call for providers, that if you're not attending those calls or listening to those calls via tape, they can be pretty useful for this type of information. So when that link is posted, I would really encourage that people listen to it, because I know that was a topic on this morning's call.
Yes, and Marcia mentioned that as well, and the recordings should be up soon. So that's where we will find out where we can get the training. We have a few minutes left. If you have, and we will, sure, we will share the link on the ACTO website as well to that call. So one more question, we have time.
Absolutely.
Don't be shy. Have one, I'm waiting for one.
Well, I have a couple things I could add.
Sure.
So as we come to the end, and thank you all for all of your questions and your participation and for your attendance here, and really for being committed to educating great coaches in the world. One of the things I would say that's been really true, at least for me in this process, is the idea of my own continued education. I think I took for granted a little bit what I thought my depth of knowledge about coaching was, or gave it more credit than I should. And part of what's come home for me in this process is how important it is to be in real conversation around coaching, and really to be in a continual education process myself around coaching. The richness of the discussions for me with the colleagues who are on the core team, and with all of the colleagues in the 3 cohorts that we have trained, has really been remarkable for me. And I wondered to myself why I had not thought to create those conversations more frequently for myself among the broad group of colleagues I know around the world. And I think in particular what came home for me is the cross-cultural conversation between programs and educators in programs is really critically important. I think that's one of the things that ACTO provides so well, is a platform for that conversation. But I realized for myself I need that conversation in smaller groups and more frequently as well, to really be sure that the richness that we bring to our students at Miami, in terms of all the different ways there are to evidence the competencies and the markers, and to engage in great coaching, is available to them, and that we as a program do not become too dogmatic. And so I think that both as a barrier against dogma, and also as a continued growth of my own breadth as a coach and my own skill set as a coach, and also in terms of creating a more connected community of coaches around the world and between programs, that piece is something that I'm going to really try and create for myself. And I would really commend to others that you try to create it for yourself, so that it's an ongoing discussion versus an intermittent discussion.
And I think ACTO can likely do something to facilitate those conversations as well. I think we'd love to be a part of that. So, so with that, thank you, Margaret. I'd love to thank everybody, and thank you in particular, Margaret, and Tracy, you as well, for bringing your experience to this call and to this forum. And I look forward to more conversations as we all try and get up to speed and embrace this new marker system. So thank you very, very much for being here. And to everybody, our next forum call will be September 16th. So have a fantastic summer. Thanks everyone for being on the call today. And have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you find yourself in the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.